Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome to Living the Solution with Dr. Elena George. Today we have an important show. We've spoken about education in the past, and we have talked about all the problems out there. And I was just telling our guests that I don't know how parents do it these days because it was just simple. When I went to school, you went to school, you learned. There was nothing else that you had to worry about or navigate. And it was about learning. I don't think that's the case anymore. In every state right now, we're seeing parents at odds with their school boards, children not learning what they're supposed to. And I mean, I guess we'll talk about it too, but I mean, we learned about cursive, we learned a gamut of things that we could use, critical thinking being one of them. I'm not sure that's still the case. And so I wanted to speak with someone who can tell us about choices, because it seems if you turn on TV, you only have one option. Either you keep your child in a situation that you may not be happy with, or you have to take on the burden yourself, which is kind of hard if you're a working parent. So today we wanted to speak with Miss Kerry McDonald. She's a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education and the host of the weekly Liberated podcast. She's also the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. She's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, education policy fellow at State Policy Network, and a regular Forbes contributor. Her research interests include homeschooling and schooling alternatives, self-directed learning, education entrepreneurship, parent empowerment, school choice, and family and child policy. Her articles are myriad, and they include the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, Washington Examiner, City Journal, Entrepreneur, and the Journal of School Choice, among others. She has a master's degree in education policy from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in economics from Bowdoin College. She lives in Massachusetts with her family, and I know, Ms. McDonald, how busy you are, so I really, really appreciate you joining me today.
Oh, I'm glad to be back with you, Dr. George. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Last time we spoke, you gave a real eye-opening presentation, really, of what's out there for parents, and it's been so adversarial over the past year. I just wanted to once again revisit everything that you do, because I think knowledge is power. And if you know something, then you can choose what's best for you and your family. So since I've last spoken with you, what's the climate like? I'm seeing it from a television standpoint, but you're on the front lines. What is it like, in your opinion, for parents now who are not necessarily happy with the direction of their child's education?
Well, I think parents now have more options than ever. I mean, we're in this transformational moment in K-12 U.S. education where parents are empowered in ways that they never were previously. And that's really a result of the COVID lockdowns and specifically remote schooling, when children's classrooms came into family homes and parents got a close-up look, in many cases for the first time, of what was actually happening in their children's classrooms, what their children were learning or were not learning, and a lot of what parents saw they didn't like. And then this prolonged remote schooling enabled families to start thinking about taking matters into their own hands. Many started to consider homeschooling because, of course, they were home with their kids anyway, and they thought, well, what does that look like? And then increasingly they discovered that it's, as you mentioned, it's not all or nothing. It's not homeschooling or sending your child to conventional school. There's a lot of room in between and a lot of education, innovation, and entrepreneurship occurring that I think parents really weren't aware of before. I mean, some of these trends were occurring in the decade before 2020, but they weren't something that was really apparent to a lot of families until, again, the school closures really brought that front and center. And what we saw during 2020 and 2021, not only were skyrocketing rates of homeschooling, doubling from in 2020 alone and tripling from pre-pandemic rates, and then remaining elevated even in 2021 and to today, while schools are back to normal. So parents really realizing that that they can take matters in their own hands, but also realizing that they do have all of these other choices. We saw in 2020 and 2021 the rise of what was called pandemic pods, which were these kind of mixed age, small learning communities, typically in family homes where parents would either hire an educator or take turns facilitating a curriculum. And that was very much like the micro schools that were, again, emerging prior to 2020, and that it's just taken off over the past couple of years. And micro schools really are that in between homeschooling and conventional schooling, where families can either go part-time or full-time 5 days a week as a full-time schooling alternative, but they tend to be smaller, much more nurturing, much more personalized, mastery-based curriculum. They're really what parents, I think, are looking for, and there's just so many more options across the country.
The first thing that comes to my mind is, what happened? Is there pushback from the standard educational system? It's very monolithic. It's very power-oriented. How are they taking this, with parents taking their power back?
Well, I think that so far, so good, right? I mean, I think families are voting with their feet. Certainly, you talked about a lot of the strife in school board meetings and so on. So there is this combination of voice and exit of families speaking out against what they don't like in schools and trying to push for change there. But increasingly, families are just fleeing their assigned district schools for some of these other options. And there's really not much that, school districts can do about that. I mean, some, interestingly enough, are trying to be a little bit more competitive and have their own micro schools within a school district. And some districts are forming these private public partnerships with national micro school networks like Prenda Learning, which creates these kind of small micro schools and learning pods so that they become tuition free, but are typically associated with a school district or some other kind of state Department of Education, as the case is in New Hampshire, that used its COVID relief money to provide these Prenda pods to families who wanted a micro school environment but couldn't afford to pay out of pocket. So, I think we're seeing those creative strategies. But for the most part, micro schools are typically a fraction of the cost of conventional private schools, often a quarter or a fifth of the cost even of a typical private school in a given area. So they're generally much more accessible to more families just by nature of their cost. And they also, in many states, are being covered by school choice policies. I spent a lot of time recently in South Florida, in the greater Fort Lauderdale area, where there is an explosion of microschooling. It's a real hub of education entrepreneurship. And the vast majority of those microschools there are participants in the state's generous tax credit scholarship program that enable education funding to follow students, typically income eligible in Florida, but increasingly in places like Arizona and West Virginia, it's more universal. And families are able to then take advantage of these micro schools tuition free, or again, at a fraction of the cost that they otherwise would be paying for a typical private school. So because this is all in the realm of private education, they're typically, accessible to more families and not kind of falling under the rubric of state oversight.
That's amazing. It's rare that you have such an egalitarian approach where money's not the object. You don't have to be, an elite group. It sounds like everybody can partake of this. I love that. So let's take our first break, because I want to ask about the bigger micro school you just mentioned. It sounds like maybe, I don't know if it's corporate or not, but I'd love to discuss that when we come back. So let's take our first break. You're living in the solution. Welcome back to Living in Solution. We're speaking with Miss Kerry McDonald. Again, she's a member of the Foundation for Economic Education. And prior to the break, you were giving a wonderful synopsis of how money is not the object anymore. It's about quality. And I love the fact that there's competition now. With the public school system before, there was no competition. Oh, you could do whatever you wanted, and everybody was a captive audience. Innovation comes from choice and from people being able to do what's best for them, and the best will rise to the top. I think that goes with everything. But you mentioned that there were, it sounds like a company or companies that have micro schooling. Can you speak a little bit more about that? Is that a corporate version of this, or is that still entrepreneurial?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I mentioned that microschools were gaining traction pre-2020, including some large microschool networks. So I think of, for example, Acton Academy, which is a large microschool network of independently run and operated microschools that are affiliated with the Acton Academy model. But it's all sort of parent and teacher entrepreneurs who launch these small learning communities, either in their homes or at a local, in a local commercial space. And they began in 2010. They now have about 280 microschools in more than 30 states and 25 countries. So that's an example of a fast-growing microschool network that's also gained much more popularity over the past couple of years, just as more and more families understand what microschooling is and want that for their kids. And there's some other microschool networks that also gained traction over the past couple of years, but that started long before that. I think of the Wildflower Montessori microschool network that was started in Massachusetts in 2014. They now have more than 60 microschools across the country and in Puerto Rico, and they actually have a few cities, including Minneapolis and New York City and Washington, D.C., where they have some charter school partnerships, so tuition free for students there. And they have also experienced a lot of growth over the past couple of years. And then Prenda is another one that I mentioned that was started in 2018 in Arizona. They've now reached roughly 10,000 students in several states, and they continue to grow as well. So there are these networks, but there's also a lot of just independent microschool founders, just entrepreneurial parents and educators who were trying to solve a problem in their own families or their own communities, who then decide to create a microschool to kind of hang up their shingle and realize that a lot of other families were wanting something similar. They wanted that personalized learning. They wanted that mastery-based content. They wanted to be able to have more involvement in their children's education. And they wanted the diversity of options. I mean, I think that's something that's really astounding about today's microschools, whether they're independent one-off microschools or they're affiliated with a national network, is there's a tremendous diversity in terms of educational philosophies and approaches. You can choose as a parent now anything from a kind of classical microschool that has kind of traditional subjects and experiences to more unstructured microschools, more of the unschooling model, to a Montessori microschool or a Waldorf microschool or any kind of educational approach and philosophy. And that just gives families so many more options, so much more customization in education, the way they have in every other part of their lives, right? Mm-hmm. We have so much personalization and choice in every other consumer decision. And up until recently, we have not had that same experience in education. And so I think the microschool movement is really a testament to the ways in which we can encourage a diversity of options for families so that they can choose the one that best fits their child's needs and their personal preferences. So it's really exciting to see, again, not only to establish networks that continue to kind of set the tone and also, provide the framework of success for microschools, but then see these one-off independent microschools really take root. And one of the surprising things that I've found in kind of covering especially the contemporary microschool movement over the past couple of years is just the sheer number of these microschools that are being launched by former public school teachers who are just burnt out and tired of working in the conventional system for a whole variety of reasons. And they are, launching their own microschools. I think, for example, of Jill Perez in New Jersey. She was a longtime public school teacher. She had more recently moved into a student teaching supervisor role at a university. When the pandemic hit, she created a pandemic pod with some other families because she wanted her kids to continue to have that kind of social experience and continue learning during the remote learning time. And it was so successful, and so many families were thrilled with what she was doing that they really were seeking more. They wanted something even more formal, more established. So last fall, in the fall of 2021, she opened a microschool in New Jersey with about 45 kids, mixed age. Families could choose either part-time or full-time. They were, recognized homeschoolers. Homeschooling is quite easy to do in New Jersey. There's very few regulations in New Jersey, so it's really easy to kind of have parents take control of their children's education. And she recruited a lot of teachers from the New York City public schools to work in her microschool because they were fed up with what they were seeing in the classroom and wanted something different. I think that's one of the things that we forget a lot of time is that teachers are as caught up in what's happening in public schools as their students are. Their hands are tied. They have to contend with standardization and bureaucracy and all of these constraints. They don't have that ability to be creative anymore. And it's frustrating for many of them. So they're either leaving to launch a micro school on their own or to potentially work in one.
I love that. Now, you've mentioned it was mixed ages. What's the youngest child that enters one of these micro schools?
So they really vary. I mean, you can have some micro schools that are truly reminiscent of the one-room schoolhouse model where you'd have kind of a K-12 micro school. And when we talk about micro schools, it's typically under 50 kids and is intentionally small. So even though these micro schools may be in high demand and a lot of families may want to take advantage of them and the founders realize they have the potential for growth, they want to stay intentionally small, typically under 50 kids, sometimes just a couple of dozen, to again allow for that personalization and individualization of learning. But many of these founders are interested in scaling. They do want to expand, but they want to expand horizontally, laterally, by opening additional small schools, additional micro schools, as opposed to expanding vertically by increasing the size of their existing micro schools. So they're really committed to that kind of small mixed age model. And then you'll see some micro schools that are more for elementary age, but again, mixed age. You might have K-6. Some, for example, one of the ones I visited in South Florida is specifically focused on middle school, has a lot